and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck your little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, bought a little Louis the 13th. Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head. My Rothschild niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas. Pension for the workers, nigga please. Embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement. I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut. Foreclosure, big holes at the tenement. I twist words like a speech impediment. I hope you got good credit, bitch. If not, better get a new job with benefits. While I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with. New money buys brand new carrots. My old money bunch of great grandparents. You got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at ya. I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building for each one of my children's children.
Welcome to UCY.TV.
Hey, everybody, this is Chris Jackson here, and Chris J here, and we are live. Welcome to UCY Radio and Voice of Real Radio, presenting you today on May 8th, 2016. 9 o'clock Eastern Time. We are doing a show about Victory Day in Russia and around the world, I guess, celebrated 71 years now after the end of the Europeans, either in World War II, and the biggest parade that's known is the one in Moscow, the big Victory Day parade they have there, which this year might be the hugest yet since the Soviet years, and they have hundreds of thousands of soldiers marching down the Red Square. And of course, notably, what we've seen the last few years is that there's been an absence of a certain president. The United States president hasn't showed up in the last few years to Victory Day, and some other West European leaders, and it all has this undertone of putting in they don't want to meet with him. They don't want to go to what they deem his celebration or his parade. So it's all that political subtext about the whole Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, which are just absolutely huge and have been resurgent recently. That they really went all out the last few years. And I think it's kind of to show that they are back. The Russia is now maybe the most powerful military power in the world, possibly even above the United States military, despite spending way less money and having just put a lot less training. I mean, real combat training when they've been barely used. However, a lot of analysts say that they do have possibly the best military on the planet and could defeat in a conventional warfare the United States military. So I guess it's somewhat of a signal to the world that, hey, we're back. We're now, we're not. This is no longer the '90s. We're no longer feeble, weak, and easily malleable. Is the word I'm thinking of. They can be easily like clay moved by the big bankers, like back in the '90s they were. Now they're not. They've moved away from the big banking sphere of the world, and now Russia became a strong sovereign country rather than a weak puppet state like it was in the 90s, where during the 90s they had people like the Goldman Sachs and other big bankers were trying to take advantage of the fall of the Soviet Union and try to do a total buyout of Russia and make sure that she controlled for hundreds of years kind of like what happened with the Federal Reserve. But before it really took any place, their power, before they had even been in power very long, Putin showed up to the scene and threw a lot of them into prison. And now you see the same ones screaming human rights violations or whatever, saying that Putin is a dictator and blah, 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 blah. But the truth is that they're just angry that they lost the power that they had in the 90s, which the bankers did a horrible thing to Russia in the 90s, also because of why they were buying up everything. A lot of the Russian people starved. A lot of them had to flee the country. But now times have changed, and going back to the Victory Day is that they regained a lot of the power that they had in the Soviet times without repeating many of the same mistakes that were repeated throughout Soviet history, including a major mistake of letting a person like Joseph Stalin take power, which despite the fact that maybe one of Russia's most important events happened in its history, happened under Joseph Stalin, and it did come out for a good outcome. Not a good outcome, but at least not the worst outcome. Because no matter how you look at it, yes, it was a victory in the end for the Russians, but the Russian people had lost at the end somewhere between a conservative estimate would be 27 million, and a possible estimate of what the highest of what some of the historians say, up to 45 million people perished in the war, which is absolutely absurd. We're considering that the country had somewhere around 200 million people, I believe, during the time of World War II. 290 million. I think that was the max population that the Soviet Union ever reached. So I think that's population was somewhere in 200 million to 200 to 275 million range at the end of World War II, or during World War II. And that number got reduced after that huge loss of life during the war. And the sink that they lost, then when you put it in process, they had around 270 million people in the Soviet Union at that time. That is 1/6 the population, up to possibly, died in the war. 16 million were soldiers and 29 million potentially. That's what I saw with some of the estimates. I think it's a widely believed number in Russia, because I think they're counting also people that died of disease, starvation, and much other things that were induced by the siege of Leningrad and major cities by the Nazis, and a lot of other factors. That's probably a true number, the 45 million. Then there was probably 27 million, is more like a number that was actually hit by, actually executed, prisoner of war, and killed, and soldiers that actually died in combat. But either way, it's great that 16 million soldiers died in the war, and the amount of civilians is anywhere from 11 to 29 million. Which, just to put in comparison, is that British and the United States combined lost 1 million civilian and military. The French lost, believe around 1 or 2 million people, and the Germans took a huge loss during the war too, considering it was a much smaller country than a smaller country than the United States, and quite a bit smaller than the Soviet Union at the time. We didn't have quite the population at the time we have now. We only had 100 million people. So in comparison, we weren't that much larger than Germany at that time, population-wise, but still Germany lost 4 million. And they had a quarter of the soldiers. So it was what happened during the Soviet battles a lot of times is that Stalin sent his men just pretty much sent men at the problem until it fixed itself. That's how he figured it. And in many ways, it almost looks like Stalin was intentionally trying to lose, or did not care about the outcome of what actually happened to the soldiers, which I know that was at the minimum. But when you look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, you look at a few other factors, it doesn't really look like Stalin had much care what happened to the Nazis, and he seemed to be, in some ways, more sympathetic to the Nazis at times, before the war had actually taken place, and the Soviet government had been more sympathetic to them at the time, and they had the real anti-fascist movements that were already against Hitler in the 30s. When you look what happened to like the betrayal, for example, the interior German military anti-fascist resistance to Hitler in 38, they were betrayed by Germany, not Germany, by Britain and Neville Chamberlain. At the end, Neville Chamberlain backed out and did not give the green light to the coup against Adolf Hitler, and then Adolf Hitler would stay in power, and then shortly after he would continue his taking of more and more lands. This is right after the Czechoslovakian siege of the Sudetenland, is when they decided that maybe it would be time that Hitler needed to be yanked off the mound, because they believed that this would just continue, which it did. Eventually it would go into Poland. And who funded Hitler is, people don't really think about that. Who's the ones that actually brought Hitler to the kind of success that was the military machine that actually enabled the German military machine to reach the strength it did by 1939, and for it to become from the weak Weimar Republic military, they couldn't even probably take on probably any other military in Europe at the time, and then became one of the most formidable military machines on the entire planet in just 6 years' time. The answer is that only the very top bankers could pour that money into Germany to make it happen. And, of course, with the very quick military surge, people often credit Hitler sometimes for saving the German economy, but a lot of these jobs that were being created were just purely to build up the war machine, which eventually the war machine of Germany led to the next step was the World War. And if you look at Hitler's rhetoric, New Order of the Ages, even says, talk about world conquest, talking about many other things that relating some kind of order for the entire planet, and that Hitler would be at the lead of it. What it sounds like is very much like a lot of times the words are kind of similar to people like Kissinger or Soros and top New World Order engineers of the day. It seems like they have to be very similar words that used to come out of these German Nazi officials. And the United States government officials, many of them say very similar things to what the German government officials said in the 30s. It's because a lot of these ended up transferring, almost had a transition. Because at the end of 1945, the war, when they had lost, a ton of Nazi officials and Nazi scientists and all kinds of Nazi party members came to the United States via Operation Paperclip. By 1948, we had some of them were brought over here. In fact, that was the first operation in the CIA, which the CIA was pretty much constructed by Nazis. And another big thing that's not told about the Nazi history is that people believe that Nazis and Zionism have no connection whatsoever, and that Zionism was a polar opposite reaction to what happened during the Nazis. The Nazis' crimes in Europe, but the truth was that they actually collaborated in the 30s and 40s, and one group was professed to be pro-Nazi in the name of being against the British. One of the three groups that would later form the IDF once Israel would actually become a state was in support of it, and these were openly declared terrorist groups. They declared themselves to be terrorists in the name of illegitimately taking the land of Israel, or land of Palestine, and rename it Israel for themselves. And there was even the transfer agreement, which was to move Jews from Germany to Palestine for it to be conquered by those Jews, who would then later turn into the state of Israel. So and the truth was that a lot of Jews around the world knew about the plans. Knew about the Nazi-Zionist collaboration, and they didn't support either of it. A lot of them around the world, but the very small minority did, like what was going on between the Nazi and the Zionist collaboration. And you have to also remember that these Zionists a lot of them weren't even practicing Jewish. They were just ethnically Jewish, which means that they how they saw it, it was just purely like the same way the Nazi thinking about a master race. They believed themselves to be superior to the rest of us. And they had a very similar mindset, and they had pretty much a similar goal, and they ended up collaborating during the 30s and the 40s. And there's every party was shut down in Germany, Nazi Germany, besides two after 1933, after the emergency powers came down by Hitler. Hitler completely seized power. When the emergency power happened, he closed down everything practically, except the Nazi Party, of course, and the Zionist Federation of Germany were the only two political parties that were even allowed to operate after 1933, which the Zionist Federation in Germany officially closed down in 1937, 4 years after the Communist Party, every other party that had been closed down in Germany. That was the ones that were actually the hardest persecuted when the first arrests started happening and the first rounds of locking down Germany happened. Was the Communist Party of Germany the members were put into jail, later were killed, because also they blamed a communist on the Reichstag fire, which was, by a lot of historians, was an inside job, kind of like 9/11, was that big event that scared the German people, believing that there was this big foreign threat where they would even burn down the parliament building, the Reichstag, named the Bundestag. So, leaving this big amount of fear in the German people, they were really willing to consent to any of this future lockdowns and future restrictions, even that, and they didn't really care that their liberties were being curtailed because they wanted to feel safe. And what they got in the end is what we know now. Is many atrocities that were committed under fascism, and also another thing is that people talk about fascism. I think that Hitler invented it, but actually Mussolini coined the term in 1924 when he, in the early 20s, was the Italian Fascist Party and its supporters, when he took Rome and took Italy and then created a country where the parliament was completely eliminated and just made the Union fascist corporations, where fascist corporations were now being represented in the government rather than people of Italy. And also the Vatican collaborated heavily with Mussolini and would later collaborate with Hitler. That Pope that was in charge during the time of Hitler would later collaborate with Hitler. And in the end, the Vatican was very much responsible for some of the stuff that went down. There was definitely collaboration between them. And it's funny, people just overlook a lot of stuff. Our school textbooks only tell little bits and pieces about what happened in World War II and trying to make it seem like we had absolutely no tie-ins, whatever. But the same bankers were, and the same corporations over here in the United States, a lot of them were funding the Nazis in the 30s, and we didn't even join in. I mean, not we, but I talk about the U.S. military did not even join into the European theater until much later. After pretty much it was nearing the end. I mean, really, we didn't go in full until D-Day, which by that time the Soviets had already pushed them way back to the point where it was very unlikely that they were going to win on June 1944. And then that was like the final closing out, was at D-Day, storming, of course, Normandy. But the British and the French had also, on the Western Front, had done a pretty good job up to that point, and they were also winning on that side. Nazis were already being constricted on both sides, making it very hard for them to have any chance stuff came back, and the United States just made sure that that wouldn't happen when they came in from the Western Front. But really, the Soviets, they had 90% of the German defeats, with the Soviets were the victors. Now, of course, like I said, the people, it's hard to call it a victory when 30 million of your people die, or more, like 45 million of your people die. And the Soviet government definitely didn't also at the same time we're doing the Stalin's purges, and we're also killing people for political differences. And ultimately Stalin killed more people, at least by direct executions based on political beliefs than Adolf Hitler. Hitler killed over there, well, the max estimate is 11 million, and Stalin killed what's believed to be 30 million. So, and then that's not even involved with the war. I mean, it was just a really rough time at that point for the Russian people, as they had to deal with Stalin and, at the same time, Hitler pushing his troops all the way into near Moscow, near Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And nowadays it's kind of odd how it's all went down. Is that now the United States is openly supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and the Russians, we are calling the bad guys in the whole situation, even though they're just trying to protect their people in eastern Ukraine. As the Ukrainian military has targeted ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and all that. And the Russians not even, all they've sent is humanitarian support. They haven't even sent any troops into eastern Ukraine. They've sent troops into Crimea. But that's it. There hasn't been any troop movement ever since March of 2014. They're still trying to act like Russia is in this active invasion of Ukraine, but it's not happening. They're even trying to fake satellite photos and all this, and it was very hokey. It was very fake. The truth was that the Russians have not entered Donetsk or entered near Lugansk or any of the Donbass region. They have not entered into East Ukraine, and that the East Ukrainians fighting by themselves. There's really no foreign support besides the humanitarian support that they receive. They receive a lot of volunteer support, but the Ukrainian military, they get support from Israel and the United States, a ton of it. Which, it's funny that, again, just like in the historical times where back 70 years ago, with Nazis and the Zionists collaborating, again, in 2016, they're still collaborating with each other. There's neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government, and at the same time, the Zionists funding them. In fact, it's believed that the Israelis supplied the Ukrainians weapons, and they probably are their second biggest funder, besides the United States. Which, right after the supposed revolution in February 2014 happened, I think the Ukrainians received like $1 billion, the Ukrainian government, from the United States State Department, right after all that went down. And it was obviously a coup. It was constructed much like the color revolutions in other places in Eastern Europe over the years. And a lot of people failed to see it, but to me it's just obvious how quickly things went down, and that almost immediately Ukrainian foreign policy changes once these clowns get into power. And now you have the Ukrainian, one of the people that was very responsible for was highly responsible for the coup, is now resigned, as he fears that possibly there's could be a potential for a revolution in Kiev against the Euromaidan government that took charge in 2014. And it's funny how on Facebook, how people will automatically jump to any time they see a protest or whatever, and they say, "Oh yeah, good for these guys," but they don't realize who these protesters are. They have no idea what they're protesting about. They just it's generally corruption or whatever. It's true that Yankovic, the last president of Ukraine, is slightly corrupt. However, what eventually happened is that this murderous, genocidal government takes control, and now over 10,000 Ukrainians are dead because of the civil war that they created. Because they are the ones that are doing massive war crimes inside of East Ukraine. For example, they shell churches, they shell residential areas. Donetsk, big parts of Donetsk are in ruins because of them. The airport's in ruins because of them. Lugansk, the major heavily populated areas, they've been shelling, they've been fighting, and even though they're technically in a ceasefire, the war continues. It's kind of like it's the same scenario as Syria. is that even though there is a ceasefire, the war continues in Syria. And it's like that's the case of warfare nowadays, and how the media covers it. They say the ceasefire, people believe it's done, even though the ceasefire doesn't mean anything, because they're still fighting, and people don't pay. People say, "Well, there was a ceasefire, it's over." No, in Syria they're still fighting. In Ukraine they're still fighting. Both the civil wars are going on despite supposed ceasefires, which Ukraine war should have been over in that case. By what's official, should have been over like a year ago, but they've been fighting pretty much the whole time ever since the April 2014, when the East Ukrainians rose up against what was the impending genocide that the Ukrainian government was willing to commit against people of ethnic Russian inside of East Ukraine, which that's where a lot of them live in Eastern Ukraine. They live near Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Crimea, which is 65% Russian. That's why Putin saw as a necessary move to go protect that from the Ukrainian government, and they went in there almost immediately. And over 90% supported to join the initiative to join Russia. Now Crimea is no longer part of Ukraine; now it's part of the Russian Federation, and now part of Ukraine is trying to split off and become its own country, not to become part of Russia. Even though that some of the people supported legislation like that, the Russian government declined, and I think a lot of them just would like to make their own country. Sometimes dubbed as Novorossiya. I just dub it as West versus East Ukraine, and I think eventually there's a possibility that Euromaidan junta will fall apart, the Euromaidan government will fall apart, but it seems though that Ukraine seems to be kind of going by a little bit slow. They've been saying this kind of stuff for quite a bit, and now stuff is not going quite as fast when stuff is not constructed and stuff is not imported, like what happened with the supposed revolution in 2014, when everything happened so quickly because it was constructed that way for a quick coup before people even realized what happened. The United States would snatch power and put their guy in eventually, which was Petro Poroshenko, in May of 2014. And now, that ever since that, and you see the tension, is that you don't, on May of 2014, you didn't see Obama go to the Victory Day parade in Russia. You didn't see that happen in 2015. You're not going to see this year in 2015. And that's really highlighted. It seems like with that Victory Day parade, it's of this new Cold War that is happening between the United States and Russia. And Russia nowadays, what the truth is that they're the resistance to the New World Order is what they're the biggest country that's in the resistance to the New World Order. And you have the United States, which is the military arm for the New World Order. So, of course, they're going to clash. And, of course, there's going to be a Cold War between them, high tensions. And you see this in proxy wars. And you see this in Syria. You see this with the Iranian and a few other things. But really, it all goes down to is that at the end, it's this big face-off that seems to be getting closer and closer between the United States and Russia. This time it seems to be real, unlike in the Cold War, where they said it was going to happen, but it actually never did happen. Here things have heated up in the matter of just 5 years. It went from friendly relations, kind of, in 2011, to now 2016, Russia's considered an enemy. You see a lot of the political campaigning for this 2016 election is directed against Russia. You see, like, for example, the attack on Trump seems to be mostly targeting the fact that, the allegations. I mean, allegations is supposedly Putin and Trump working together when really this whole blown out of proportion, that putting this kind words about Trump with no way of endorsement and really just a few comments that should be seen no more than that, and really just diplomacy, really, somebody that they thought might become the president. Russia is Russia is a country that's resistant to the New World Order. So Iran, so Syria, and they all have something in common is that they kicked out the Rothschild bankers. And Russia did that, and now they're going to soon probably back ruble by gold. And once that happens, is that the bankers will be very hard for them to find a way into Russia if they do that. And the bankers have been trying to pave ways. I think they've been delusional a little bit, and they've been trying to look for ways that are impossible. They think that they can gain power via something like what happened in Ukraine, and they tried that in 2011 to take out Medvedev and Putin ahead of the 2012 elections, and they had these big protests that really didn't go anywhere. And ultimately, just a few bigger counter rallies came out for Putin and United Russia and the Russian government, rather than these protests that, I mean, they actually gained some pretty significant numbers, but the counter rallies ended up being bigger. And Putin, in the end, won the election with a huge amount of the vote. People cried and cried fraud, but it was the truth was he won by a complete landslide. He had almost 60% of the vote, and the closest competitor had 17%. Zyuganov of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And then, next guy had 8% of the vote. So I don't think that there was any way that it was even any bit close an election. However, in Ukraine, that's what happened in 2014 was their presidential election. That was pretty much a fraud because it was two Euromaidan candidates against each other, and eventually the Poroshenko, the oligarch, the one that looked like was picked from the very beginning to become the next president of Russia or the next president of Ukraine, eventually won. The billionaire, and now he became the face of, well, now he's a pretty unpopular face of the Euromaidan movement in Ukraine, and deservingly so. I mean, just Poroshenko is pretty sick what he's done in Ukraine, and he's pretty much, people must realize there that these once in that hasn't happened in a while is literally just splitting the country up from west and east. I mean, it sounds a lot like the split of West and Germany. That there's a potential that one day you're going to see, East Ukraine will be liberated, and West Ukraine will be under control of the Euromaidan, and be a wall separating the two countries, or something like that, like what happened with West and East Berlin. But let's talk a little bit more about the craziness that was World War II, Victory Day, and the Russian people are not necessarily celebrating Stalin or the Soviet government when they celebrate Victory Day. They're not celebrating the terrible strategies that almost ended up costing them the war, but they're just celebrating that they're able to overcome that huge adversity that happened, where they were being starved, they had no fuel, they were freezing to death. In Leningrad and Moscow, the siege where over 1 million people died in both cities. I know in Leningrad over 1 million people died, and the Nazis were that close to taking over Moscow, and it would have been the end of the war if they were able to capture Moscow and officially would be controlling Russia, and that would be the end of the Russian involvement in World War II. And possibly the end of starting to be towards the end of the whole war in general, because at that point there would just be China and the United States, Britain and France, which Britain and France and the United States role all combined still wasn't as big as either the Russian or the Chinese effort in World War II. People also forget about the Chinese effort in World War II. And it was the Chinese at that time weren't controlled by Mao Zedong or the Communist Party of China. At that point, they were still being controlled by KMT, and they. That's what seems a little bit weird about when the CPC is celebrating. Well, they have a victory day parade in Beijing too, but they were fighting at the time. The government they were fighting the same military that was fighting the Japanese, and in some ways they were assisting the Japanese effort to conquer China. And really, it was the KMT and the Chinese Republic that defeated the Japanese. It seemed almost to be better to see a giant victory day parade in Taiwan. But we know that the Taiwan government has been, the whole Taiwanese cause has been definitely heavily perverted by the United States, using them as a tool, sometimes supporting them, sometimes not. They've been played like a fiddle for many years. And I think nowadays they've kind of moved away. For example, are making allies with countries like Vietnam and making some more local allies rather than relying completely on the United States. The Chinese lost 10 million people via executions by the Japanese. This is just civilians. They lost a few million, I believe, soldiers during the war. The Japanese had conquered a giant part of eastern China, where they had conquered probably like 80% of the population, because there's a line pretty far east in China where 94% of the people in China live east of that line, only 6% live west of this giant part of China, where it's just so rural that in many parts are just completely uninhabited and just a few people there, And then you go far enough west in China, they don't speak really the same language. I mean, their dialect, the Chinese, is so different from the people like in the eastern part of China that they could barely understand each other when they're talking. But they had conquered, so they almost had conquered China, Japanese, and then they were pushed back, and the Japanese had also conquered Southeast Asia. They had conquered, well, they already had controlled Korea. They had controlled Korea since 1905. They had controlled. They were taking over the Philippines. They were taking over many Pacific islands. The Japanese Empire at that time, what they had taken, reached thousands of miles, because they had taken stuff that was almost in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, they were not very far from actually reaching Hawaii. We know about the Battle of Midway, which Midway Islands are not that far from the Hawaiian island. They had the Marshall Islands, had many island ranges out there. It was not too many people, but it just the territory, that meant that the territory stretched just that much further from the Japanese empire. And then, in a big part, because of the Chinese, on the western front, the Japanese were defeated. And, of course, the United States, that's the main thing, the eastern front of the Japanese, pushing them back west. Huge battles, of course, like Midway, Iwo Jima. Little known fact is that even the Japanese had reached so far east, they actually had reached the United States at one point. Just in the northwest of the United States, they had reached Alaska, which at that time was a state, but still was the United States territory, when they actually had reached the Aleutian Islands. And there was some battles up there on the Aleutians. Which also during World War II, there was also on the eastern side, from the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, Nazi submarines had landed twice, and Nazi soldiers were gunned down or captured on two different occasions. It's like one of the submarines landed in New York and one landed in Florida, and soldiers got out, but it wasn't really much of a big deal because they were almost immediately captured or killed. But the invasion of the Aleutians, when that happened early in the war, I think it was like 1942 that happened. That was the first time since the war of 1812 that a foreign entity was actually able to reach the United States and invade, which that was 130 years without that happening. During the war, let's not forget the fact that definitely, to one extent or another, that FDR had some kind of foreknowledge about the Pearl Harbor attacks, and it was not from complete surprise. The fact that he let it happen, or at least didn't prepare for it adequately. Either way, it's incompetence, or either deliberately what could be very, very much as treason occurred. And it's the whole war too. In our textbooks, it portrayed so much like good guys, bad guys, and that's it. The truth wasn't, and they don't even talk about the people that were like kind of in the middle, like for example, Tito's military. That wasn't really, they weren't really supported by the Soviets. They weren't supported by really any of the Allies, and they had to fight the Nazis at the same time, and they were probably the most effective like grassroots resistance because they came out really of nowhere. They were just partisans that for the war were just in opposition of the monarchy in Yugoslavia, and then mobilized themselves to the point where they became the effective military Yugoslavia. They took over the country and eventually formed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which later would be ran by Joseph Tito after he was a hero in the war. And really, Joseph Tito's leading the Yugoslav people to victory was incredible, but they took a huge loss for the country that size. They took they took the second biggest loss of any Allied country, or any Allied European country. They took the third biggest loss of any Allied country because China took the second biggest loss after Russia. And Yugoslavia, 4 million people died in Yugoslavia during the resistance to the fascists, which was a huge number for a country that size. Which is, you see the 6 countries that broke away from it after the fall of Yugoslavia in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it ended up being only. These countries are tiny. Serbia, being the biggest country, and then you have like Montenegro, a very small country. There was Bosnia, and trying to think, Macedonia, being another country in there, Kosovo, and there's one more, and Croatia. All pretty small countries, and yet combined it makes a slightly larger country, but it's not much bigger than, for example, like Italy, and 4 million were lost in just a few years span there, 3 years or so after the resistance started, because that was after they had seized power from the monarchy. Which actually the odd thing was that Peter II of Yugoslavia, who was the monarch that they deposed from power, actually pretty much said, "Go ahead, go defeat those Nazis," which a lot of Peter II supporters were actually collaborating with the Nazis, and the Chetniks were kind of like a split-off, even though the monarchy themselves were not necessarily in favor of the Nazis. The Chetniks definitely, and they weren't. The monarchy of Yugoslavia did not seem to be, they seemed to be just really neutral during the war, and that's probably was the position we're going to take. The Chetniks claimed to have been neutral, claimed to be following after Peter II's ideas, and wanted to restore the monarchy to power, but they were ultimately just collaborating with the Nazis in reality, and sabotaged a lot of the Yugoslavian partisans' efforts to quell the Nazis in Southeast Europe. And Tito led the army himself, and this was at that point. This was already Tito's 4th war that he had been involved in. That's another thing just absolutely remarkable about Tito, is that even though he was the de facto leader in many ways at that point, the de facto leader of Yugoslavia, he was out there fighting himself and was actually leading those troops out physically as a general at the same time as being the head of state. You think that he could have delegated that to somebody, but he figured that only he knew how to get the job done, and probably no other person could have done what he did, because they were against all odds, they were actually able to keep the Nazis from taking over without any help from any other allies, for the most part. The Soviets gave them almost practically no help, and the other allies gave them nothing. In fact, and it's even alleged that the Soviets might have even were against really the partisan efforts, and they eventually tried to side with them, but they didn't. They would eventually split away when they realized they couldn't control Yugoslavia, and they could control the ideology of Tito. They couldn't control Tito's influence. And Tito would later become not only a star in his own country, become a star and an ideological, make his own ideology practically, and a few other third world countries, and he kind of led resistance to the Eastern Bloc's domination of the left during the 50s and the 60s, of the radical left, that is. Because Tito was a communist. However, he was not in favor of the Soviet brand of communism, nor really any other brand besides one that really, one that would support national sovereignty. And he really didn't like the economic model necessarily that the Soviets had. He didn't believe in state control, which that's really being orthodox, going back to what the orthodox socialist idea of production is, that doesn't say for the state to control the production. It says for eventually the workers to control the production, and that the state to not be existent. But the Soviets had no intention of ever completely getting rid of the state. The states wasn't really involved until, well, it later got reformed, but until like the 60s, had what was a self-management. The workers did truly run the production of Yugoslavia, and they had a very good economy, but then they ran into some trouble because they had a very hard time trading, because they were kind of a pariah around the world. They kind of fell into the same boat as, for example, maybe like a Gaddafi or something. Is that Gaddafi was disliked by both sides really in the Cold War. And both sides distanced themselves from Gaddafi, and then Tito in some ways was very similar to Gaddafi for Europe. But Tito's war efforts, his war record was pretty incredible, because in World War I he fought with the Austro-Hungarians against the Allies, the Entente, as they called them, Russia, Britain, United States. Which the United States' involvement in World War I is always just it's just puzzling. They had absolutely no need to be over there for whatever reason. The only reason, of course, was the false flag that was the Lusitania, that was staged by. Really, it was kind of, it's funny that Churchill was very much involved in Lusitania thinking, and eventually he become he was high up where he could have told the United States that, hey, how about steer that ship away from the German submarines? And knew where the German submarines were, but he intentionally allowed that ship to go to the German submarines because he knew that would draw the United States into the war, which they needed, because at that time Russia had they didn't know what eventually would happen with the Russian effort, because Russia did eventually drop out of the war. This was in 1915, Lusitania. But the United States would eventually be involved in 1917 after the supposed Zimmerman telegram, which to me sounds like a just complete fake. I mean, there's no other proof of the Zimmerman telegram actually happening besides the U.S. and British intelligence saying so. A telegram supposedly intercepted between Germany and Mexico, saying that they wanted Mexico to side with Germany. And then later, apparently the Germans wanted to collaborate with the Zapatistas and other revolutionaries against the United States government and the United States people, supposedly. This all went down. That Germany would try to involve themselves as a country that they had really no relation with before, and way over here on this sphere of the world, or this part of the world, which to me, of course, it seems like classic false flag strategies. You see them still repeated this day, that the people still fall from 100 years later. The same kind of tactics that drew Americans in that very ugly war. I mean, World War I, in many ways, is more uglier than World War II because of the use of gas and the trench warfare. It was so gritty and so awful. And nowadays, gas warfare, I guess, has become somewhat normalized. I mean, we've had the United States has used gas in Iraq, and Israel uses gas against the Palestinians. It's normalized as long as the Western country uses it. Seems to be the case. And then in the 80s, you didn't hear anything about the Iraq, about Saddam gassing the Kurds until 1991. Why? It happened in 1987. Why didn't we hear much about it then? Oh, yeah, wait, because at that time the United States was supportive of Saddam and green-lighted the gassing the Kurds in 87. At that time, Saddam was an ally of the United States. And with that, Saddam being an ally of the United States, the media did the lip service they usually did with what they do with Israel when they gas the Palestinians, or when our government does, or our military does something in Iraq or Afghanistan, and using chemical weapons, or what happens with the Syrian rebels, and they use they have actually more evidence than is being shown that the Syrian rebels actually use chemical weapons. And I mean, on top of their huge list of war crimes that they committed in this war in Syria, that's just one more is the potential use of chemical weapons. We're going back to what I was saying, is that Tito was actually was in World War I. He was in the Russian Civil War and Spanish Civil War. Again, I was talking about you didn't see the Soviets helping the anti-fascist resistance in Europe. In fact, they sabotaged the anti-fascist resistance inside of Spain against Franco and his fascist forces that would later become a dictatorship that would last well over 3 decades. And in fact, the United States and NATO would become supportive of them during the Cold War, all the way up to his death in 1975. So after that, World War II happens, and then Tito's a part of that and leads the Yugoslav army to victory in South Europe, and later would become very popular to the point where it was practically just, it was a cinch for the president of Yugoslavia in 1946, and then he would stay president for the next over 30 years. And he had tons of support of the people of Yugoslavia, and when he died, that's really when things started to go downhill for Yugoslavia, because ethnic tension started to climb in the mid 80s. And then after that, a war broke out, I believe, in the early 90s. Then another war broke out in 1999 that NATO would actually get involved. They bombed Yugoslavia, and then the total collapse of it happened in 2003, when officially Yugoslavia was no longer part of the map. And Yugoslavia split apart officially. What was left of it, or was actually renamed, I think, is what happened, because it was already had been split apart to the point where it's just Serbia and Montenegro. And yeah, then it was just renamed Serbia and Montenegro, and then Montenegro splits apart in 2006. Then part of Serbia splits off in 2006. Kosovo splits off. And now that's the complete disintegration of Yugoslavia over the years. Now in 1991 also was really the end of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and then Slobodan Milosevic would become the president for the next few years, which he's later the one that becomes the fall guy for all of it. He's the one that gets put in jail, at least, in the end. And he actually dies in 2006 in prison. He's the one that's blamed for it, but it was foreign influence that was pulling these ethnic, all these ethnic minorities and ethnic groups inside of Yugoslavia apart. It's pretty ethnically diverse for being such a small region right there in the Balkans. And now a lot of people wish that they was back inside of Serbia and these other countries. And I would actually say that that they have a pretty high likelihood of making a state like that coming back. But the only problem is that some of these countries have been, like, for example, Kosovo would never rejoin it because they're controlled by cartels and puppet states or puppet governments that led to it becoming puppet states. Like, and Kosovo just became like pretty much like a gun-running state of some kind in the last, it's very short 8 years of existence. And like I said before, they don't have much of a culture. It was really just a creation, arbitrary creation of the West, split apart Serbia, and really on their, this is true, that on their flag is just the shape of the territory, and like, and then it's in white, the shape of the territory, and then blue surrounding it. It's not very creative, not very well thought out, and you get this technically a country, Kosovo, and Kosovo just draws hatred. It's a pretty ugly place, and it's a sign of what the whole collapse. This is the end result. Now the whole Southeast Europe, and it's kind of reminiscent of what happened in Eastern Europe and Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. It's kind of how Southeast Europe kind of feels today, but Serbia is kind of on the rebound somewhat, but it still hasn't really quite bounced back to the beautiful place it was in the 70s and 80s. Or I would say probably the 70s is when it reached its peak, because when the 80s happened. It was like around 80, 81 when it comes to how built up it looked. Like you could old tourist commercials and stuff like that for Yugoslavia, or old videos of Yugoslavia back then. So this looks to be an absolutely beautiful country, very affordable living for the people there. And they have such a high standard of living that they've lost. In Russia nowadays, they've regained their standard of living. Really, they never regained. I don't know if you can say at any other time they had this high standard of living, because, yeah, when they had the Soviet Union had that kind of power in the 60s and 70s, the people weren't living very free like they are today, and it was definitely not this free expression. I mean, like Brezhnev, that was probably when the Soviet Union reached its peak of power in the 70s. Well, Brezhnev kind of ran a pretty tight ship. I mean, it wasn't as bad as Joseph Stalin, but Brezhnev was still doing political repressions and still doing was really treating his third world allies, supposed allies, people that he tried to act like that he supported, but really in the end backstabbed, like Che Guevara, who he left to die, and he actually supported people against Che Guevara. He supported the Communist Party of Bolivia, which were the Communist Party of Bolivia were against Che Guevara, and he didn't like Che Guevara because Che Guevara wasn't willing to bow down to either the Soviet Union or the United States. And it was another mistake that was done by, like, a very similar mistake that was done later in the Brezhnev era, was that Brezhnev would later, at the very end, almost when near his death, I think he is when he gives the support to Saddam in Iraq rather than the Khomeinis in Iran, which is funny that in despite having both the world power of the Soviet Union and the United States against them, supporting Iraq, Iran still wins the war. Which that's why at the time I dubbed the United States to be the greater state and called the Soviet Union to be the lesser state. Which nowadays Russia and Iran enjoy a pretty strong relationship with a lot of trade and a lot of military cooperation. Which now they both share one thing, is that they don't have a Rothschild bank in either one of those countries. And probably very highly likely tomorrow you'll see somebody from Iran representing the country at the Victory Day parade tomorrow. Possibly even Khamenei or Rouhani himself, the president of Iran. Which actually the Victory Day parade will be really not tomorrow. It'll probably happen. Will be the middle of the night for us. They're 8 hours ahead. It'll probably be happening around midday tomorrow there. So it'll be early in the morning for us tomorrow morning. Right now it would be about 10 o'clock here on the East Coast at about 8 hours. I think it's 8 hours to Moscow. So it is 6 in the morning there right now. So they're already having their festivities are starting. People are probably already getting up. So I know they have the day off, so they don't have to worry about going to work or anything like that. It's a huge deal in Russia. And here we still have this. I mean, we still we're part of the victory in Europe, but it's not that big of a deal, is it? Victory VE Day, May 9th, 1945. Even though we were part of it, we don't have any bit of a holiday or nothing like that. Neither do we have this September 2nd, 1945. Don't have that, that was actually the end of War II in its entirety, because that's when Japan officially surrenders and signs the agreements officially ending the war. But Russia, they make a huge deal about Victory Day, and it's kind of like two back-to-back holidays, because they made it a big deal, and then Victory Day is a big deal. Both at 8 days of each other. And then, they don't even have, for example, I think Victory Day might be bigger than, they have like a Russia Day officially on June 12th. But Victory Day supersedes that. It's the most important holiday for the Russian people. Hundreds of thousands of people, or hundreds of thousands of troops marching, probably millions of spectators out on the streets of Red Square. And a few people connected to the Voice Rebellion. I mean, I think Joaquin Flores, Fort Roos, who I talk about Fort Roos quite a bit for having good articles, and Fort Roos and Voice of Rebellion, I guess we somewhat collaborate with each other on certain stuff. And I think Joaquin Flores is in Moscow for the parade. And I don't know if actually, I was gonna say one other journalist, but I realized that that network doesn't. We don't really collaborate. I wish we came into somewhat of a collaboration with RT News. I know one journalist over there on RT, and I think that he might be over there, but I don't think he's gonna make the trip all the way to Moscow. I think he would have mentioned something about it. Because he would have to be there practically now in order to make it for the parade in just 6 or 7 hours from now. And the whole thing about this year is that, again, is the whole shadow of this Cold War II that's going on, and the election and a few other things. It's really a little bit more than just a celebration. It's funny that people they see they compare Trump to Putin, but actually Russia says that they're going to give, supposedly, at least that's what I saw, that Russia might give political asylum to Americans if Trump is elected president. So I think they ought to, if any of these three become elected president, which now it's down 3 people after the Zodiac killer dropped out. when I mentioned Zodiac Killer, we all know that Ted Cruz, when Ted Cruz, he kisses up to Israel, he kissed up to Israel so much, and you see people in the front rows of his rallies, they'd be like, oh, we love Israel and stuff like that. And Ted Cruz announces the vice presidential candidate, then drops out like 6 days later. So, I don't know what was the deal. Maybe Carly Fiorina was like, wait a minute, if this goes anywhere, I might be Zodiac killed once I get in the White House. I got to tell Ted I can't do this. And Ted's like, okay, we'll just screw it, cancel the campaign. Get back to my old job. So it's kind of funny. It was the Ted Cruz Zodiac Killer meme. Is that actually when you look at the sketch, it looks a little bit more like a younger Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was actually alive back then during the years of the Zodiac killings. So if anybody's a Zodiac killer, I guess it'd be Bernie Sanders. But Ted Cruz just matches the personality of one who would think of a serial killer. I mean, the dude's creepy as hell. It's his weird faces that he puts on, and how he talks. All of it's really creepy. I mean, Trump, one thing to say is that he's creepy in a whole different way. I mean, it was definitely when it sounds like lusting over his daughter. Really, it just seems to be the comments that he says. I mean, some people, the stuff that really pushes my nerves that Trump says is not the stuff that pushes other people's nerves. The stuff that pushes other people's nerves is not really what pushes my nerves. Like when he said that we should shoot down that Su-24 plane that flew by that ship was in the Baltic Sea near Russian waters, and he thought that to be a provocation worse of shooting down a plane, risking a war with the Russians over. When he said those words after he claimed that he wanted better relations with Russia, that's the kind of stuff that really got me pissed off. But when he says something like the big thing I've seen over and over again is one time on a Celebrity Apprentice he said something like, "Oh yeah, her on her knees, that looks like a pretty picture," or yeah, her being on her knees, that would be a pretty picture. So listen to this one woman that was on a show. I'm like, number one, it was a TV show. Number two, that's kind of stuff that happens on this kind of TV shows, on a reality TV show. If the guy says a corny, creepy line, is that nearly as bad as calling for possible World War III and saying that you'd also bomb the Iranians as long as the Saudis paid? Or what's another terrifying quotes of him is that, oh yeah, keep letting Israel keep expanding the settlements. At the same time, though, he says, I'll be neutral in the Israel-Palestine situation. Then he says, in the debate, when he's questioned about it, I need to at least pretend I'll be neutral so I can, pretty much what he says, so I can trick Palestinians into signing a terrible agreement with the Israelis. That's the kind of stuff that's more alarming to hear from Trump than anything this, terrifying misogynist stuff that, people with feminists really rant over that kind of stuff, but they won't rant over the really important issues. And yes, the wall, what's really bad about that is not really that he's saying it. It's bad that people actually believe that they'll do anything, and that people actually believe or want a giant wall like that on a border and believe it's feasible to get them to pay for it. It's not. It can't even. It's sad that people actually believe that these suggestions can happen, that we can get Mexico to pay for a wall on the border like nothing, that they'll agree to it, that we can get that we can find all the illegal immigrants in this country and deport them back to their countries, or the Muslim ban, where his only test to test if somebody's Muslim is by asking them a set of questions. Is that these kind of not only horribly violations of liberty or whatever these suggestions that he does, it's infeasible. And what people believe to be feasible and what people believe is actually possible has been so blurred. And people really believe that Trump or some other politicians is just like a superhero that can fix everything out of nowhere. And they won't. They're all on the same page on foreign policy, same page on domestic policy. With stuff that actually counts. I mean, Bernie Sanders is almost out of it. Even if he stays around and somehow gets a nomination, he's really the same with Trump on a lot of issues. And the stuff that actually differs from what the establishment wants is just bait to get you to support that, to continue to stay supportive of the electoral system until the election, and then you can put in whatever puppet they want for martial law. I still think that Hillary Clinton is definitely going to be that puppet in the end. And it's going to go down to Hillary versus Trump, and Hillary will defeat Trump, and then after that we'll have martial law, a huge war with Iran, who she said she would bomb back in 2006, I believe 2007. She gave her word to AIPAC that she'll bomb them, and it'll be 10 years later, but it'll actually happen. This build-up with the war with Iran, the build-up of the war with Iran, it's kind of similar to the build-up prior to some other wars in the past, and people think that just because it's taken this long so far, that won't happen. But it did take 30 years for World War I to build up before it actually happened. It had been building up since the 1880s. And it eventually happened in the 1910s. War II was a bit quicker, the build-up. It really happened just a matter of a few years. It went from, Nazi Germany not even being in existence 6 years prior to the war, and then later, just 6 years after Nazi Germany coming into existence, World War II starts. And then for the next 6 years, the war, everything that happens in the war happens in just that 6-year span. 6 years and a day, to be exact. September 1st, 1939 was actually when Germany invaded Poland. And then the day when Japan surrenders to the United States was September 2nd, 1945. So all that happens that quickly. And think about what be 6 years and a day from today, going back. That would be May 8th, 2010. So imagine everything from the war started on May 8th, 2010, and then all the stuff that happened in World War II, and then today's the day that the surrender happens. It's all that went down pretty quickly. And then if you want to go back to when the Nazi became the power and Hitler takes power, it's only 12 years between when Hitler took power and the end of the war, and Europe being in ruins, and they would suffer the consequences for the next 30 years really before it's completely built up again. The consequences that a lot of East Europe felt afterwards, the consequences of being in East Europe afterwards is that a lot of countries got sucked into the Warsaw Pact, even if they didn't want to be a part of the Warsaw Pact. Yugoslavia had the right idea. They just didn't become part of that shit in the first place, and they wanted to stay completely sovereign. And people criticized them for it, and people believed it to be the wrong direction, that they wouldn't pick the United States or the Soviet Union. And eventually, the Yugoslavia proved them wrong, and they made the highest standard of living of any of the European countries during the 70s. And those people were the people that were never been unified before like that. There wasn't that much unification during the monarchy. There hadn't been that much unification prior to Yugoslavia's existence, and all of a sudden they were comrades, brothers, whatever you call it, during the time of Tito, which was for 35 years, and he was able to achieve that unity in just a few years' time. But it's all that, talk about the Soviet government a little bit harshly, but the Soviet people and the Russian people today they did fight a very noble cause in World War II, and by eliminating the Nazis, probably has at least delayed the New World Order plans by quite a significant amount of time, because if the Nazis had stayed around, I think that they had been pushing forward, possibly a date like 1984 possibly could have been the original plan for them to have been in control of the planet, if the Nazis were able to have won the war, then the amount of time would have been numbered. If they were able to have beat the Soviets and then beat the Allies, then the only country that'd be left would be China. And then I guess they're going to let Japan handle that. But the Chinese were able to beat the Japanese, and the Russians were able to beat the Germans. The Russians had fought some of the worst battles in human history. Stalingrad, for example. Stalingrad, over 1 million died on the Soviet side just in one battle alone, just about 1 month. In February, I think it was February 1943. February 1942 is when Stalingrad went down. I know Operation Barbarossa started in 1941, and then 1942, I think, is when the Nazis had reached the furthest east, and they were already being pushed back by 43. 44, they were almost towards certain defeat, and 45, they were done. That was really just the closing out months, the last few months, and early 1945 when they're fighting still. The Soviets, though, they had tough fighting all the way up to the end of the war. Even when there was siege in Berlin and ending the war, the Soviets had originally claimed Berlin, and then they had lost it, and they were still fighting all the way into May after Hitler either died or escaped, whatever happened. When Hitler disappeared, he officially died, they still were fighting for almost a week afterwards. And War II really in Germany didn't end until literally that day when the red banner was put over the Reichstag, and the Nazis officially at that point then surrendered unconditionally. They had absolutely no other choice. And then most of them would get away. Most of the Nazis would either go to the United States and join ranks inside the United States government, or there was a lot of watching them. That wasn't the majority of them, but some of them did that. Or a majority of them went down to South America via the rat lines, and they went down to South America, to Argentina, Brazil, a few other countries where a lot of them would have quite a bit of political influence, even like Klaus Barbie, all the way up to the 60s, the 70s, and then a few of them, 16 of them, I think, were convicted at Nuremberg. But and then there was like a case like Goring. I think Goring committed suicide right before that he was going to be tried at Nuremberg, and so very few of them actually spent much time in prison. A few of them got captured later. The Mossad did the ceremonial capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960, which I think was just completely just for show, and try to make it seem like they were actually concerned about that. When the Mossad was more at that time in the Cold War doing stuff like the USS Liberty and other, or the Lavon affair, they were more concerned about keeping the United States in line than they were with dealing with the Nazis and ex-Nazi war criminals. That was what they were focusing on, the Cold War, which happened 7 years after the supposed capture of Adolf Eichmann, where if that was even truly him, they say he was working at a Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz factory, which I think, in a way, doesn't that just seem like a jab at Germans like that? It's like, oh, even with all the money in the world or all the power in the world, that he still had some of the wealth coming from Germany. In the end, he decides to keep on working because they're workaholics, and that he goes to a car factory. Yes, it seemed a little bit kind of stereotypical, and the story seemed to be just painting out the ideal escape of the Germans to Argentina. But I don't think they can. I think either they just did it for show, or it was a ceremonial capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960. And then every now and then they still, to this day, still capture people. Even like now, 2016, 71 years after the war, they still capture one of them. They say, 97-year-old Nazi veteran going on trial, which at this point is like, why even bother? They spent their entire lives, they escaped, and usually, a lot of times, it's not even like a high-ranking person. It's like if you go after a soldier, like an enlisted soldier that had no other choice, a lot of times it would be hanged or fight. Is that really ethical? And these people are 97 years old and stuff. They don't even probably remember much of what happened 70-plus years ago when they were still teenagers. Some of them were still kids. At the end, it was known that they were using 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, because they were that desperate in 1945 for soldiers. One other connection to all the Nazis and one more World War II connection is that's forgotten about is that the current more contemporary Vatican connection is that Pope Benedict, the one that just left in 2013, was actually he was actually part of the Nazi use, which yes, children didn't have much of a choice. And then he actually ended up, he was enlisted, I believe, in the Nazi army at the end. Or was about to be enlisted. He was already 18 by the time the war ended, or in 1945, and because the war ended, he got out of it. And the dude just looks completely evil in the eyes. You say the eyes were the windows of the soul, and you just look at his death stare that he'd be giving people. And the few years that he was the Pope, and then he just resigns out of nowhere, which had been the first time in like over 500 years he resigns out of nowhere. Soviets, during the war, fought through some of the most harshest conditions as well. I mean, it was like -20, -30 degrees a lot of times in some of these battles. And that's why the Nazis didn't have the proper gear when they got there. It was kind of a repeat. It had to be kind of like a repeat of Napoleon. What happened with Napoleon when he went to capture Russia, when the French were taking territory here and there, was said to be going after world conquest. When Napoleon got there, number one, he had left too late, so he was ill-prepared for winter. And then when he got to Moscow, there was nothing for his soldiers to take because they did scorched earth policy, where they burnt down everything that there would be left to take. So the French were either starved or froze out, and that started the pushback from the Russians of the French out of their territory, or I guess finished the pushback of the Russians pushing back the French out of their territory. And then after that, the French kind of really were on the retreat when it came to just Napoleonic wars in general, because eventually they would be defeated by the British to seal their defeat of the war, and that was the downfall of Napoleon. As he died just a few years later, he didn't live a long life. I think he only lived to 50-something years old, and he did all that stuff during the war, during the Napoleonic Wars, during his lifetime. He was able to become the Emperor of France, in control for like 15 years, and then he was out of the scene for. I don't think he died as the Emperor of France. I think he was already out of power when he died in 1821, I believe. His story is a little bit different than Hitler, because Napoleon was fighting back against the British Empire at the time, and I think that Napoleon, the French Revolution, was truly about the people were angry about the French monarchy and tired of the centuries and centuries of how it had been in Europe, of the monarchs and practically the rest of the people being practically slaves. And then a lot of people rose up, a lot of people fought, and I think Napoleon, he did reform the country heavily, And actually, when it comes to the progress of the workers and how the progress of French society, they had went very far in just a short period of time under Napoleon. Unlike what happened in Nazi Germany, where how workers were treated in Nazi Germany was pretty bad. I mean, there was some very harsh restrictions from what I seen in Nazi Germany. And when it comes to the progress and social tolerance, compared to, like, for example, during the German Empire, just 40 years before, the people in Germany were much more tolerant of other religions and the other nationalities during that time than they were in the time of the Nazis, where they only pretended for the Olympics in 1936 to be tolerant, but for the rest of the time we know the story. And any other group that was besides the norm. I mean, one thing about Nazi Germany that's really talked about, they do disservice in the textbooks, is that they try to make it seem like only Jews suffered, or that they took the majority of the suffering during the Holocaust and during the repression of the Nazis. But the truth was that the many groups did, not just them, the political groups, unionists, blacks, all kinds of people suffered. Even Lutherans and sects of the Protestant Christian Church were persecuted during the time of the Nazis. Jews, Zionists used that as an argument, that they try to make it seem like the Jews were the majority, were just suffered the worst of anybody, so they could take the state of Israel and create the state of Israel. It was used as a political tool by people that collaborated with the Nazis for that to happen, like that one major terrorist group inside of Palestine at that time that collaborated with the Nazis. But they still used it as a tool in order to justify the creation of the state of Israel and kicking out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and murdering hundreds of thousands, well, at least tens of thousands of Palestinians were murdered during Al-Nakba, or translated to English, the tragedy, in 1948. And, hey, Vince, you there? I got a call coming in. I need to take this. Back, I'll just respond to it as a text message. Well, I'm like trying to figure out who's calling me. It's like I'm trying to recognize the number. I hate that one. It's just like people want to contact you at an opportune time when you're either like working or doing the radio show. Which to me, I almost consider this, even though I don't get paid or anything like that, I almost take it with. I think I take this as more seriousness than I take it with more seriousness. What people say about my performance on a show more seriously than my performance at work, to be honest. Because to me, this is one of the most important things I do every week: informing people, connecting with people, or as Vince does, connect voices. And as all radio hosts, that's kind of our job. But especially with Vince, is that he produces for me and produces for a few other people, I believe. So he's connecting the voices, connecting the radio shows, and letting different people get out their different opinions on these different alternative media shows. And can't thank you enough, Vince, for doing what you do for our show here. And always getting a cool graphic or whatever, making a little cool promo for Real Liberty Media, and just do a little shout out to the different people listening out there. Here on UCY, Real Liberty Media, Freedom Network, and all the other places where this show gets shared out to. Of course, our main three: Freedom Network, Voice of Rebellion, and UCY. Thanks to all of you for listening to the show and share it with your friends. And can't believe already May. That already Victory Day has rolled around again. Last year, I know we did on Voice of Rebellion Radio, we did a show on Victory Day around the same time. It couldn't have been on the same day because, of course, the year changed. Now the 8th is on Sunday this year, which now we're almost at where we actually have on the 9th. But it's like it's almost that this is going on. The show's going on within just a few hours of the parade happening in Moscow, because they do their parade in Moscow around midday, and it's already early morning over there in Moscow. I wonder how it must be. It's probably going to be a pretty cold one, I bet. Unless, it would be weird if it ends up being actually pretty warm, because down here in Florida, it's actually been pretty cool this weekend. The coolest day I've ever seen in May happen this week. And I wonder if they're going to have it's going to correspond to their having like a really freezing one. It's going to be snowing or something like that. Or are they going to have it's going to be a beautiful day. It's going to be 82 degrees or something like that. That'll be interesting. So call it right now, though, is that somebody on, well, if there is any coverage right now, if there's any coverage in the days after the Victory Day, that they won't be talking about what the Russians did during World War II. They'll be talking about that this is a sign of a provocation. This is Russians getting ready for war, that this huge military parade, this is the biggest march since the fall of the Soviet Union, which would be true. This is probably going to be the biggest parade since the end of the Soviet Union inside of Russia, but it won't be anything positive coming from our media. If they don't cover something really fluff story like right now, of course, the media won't stop talking about Trump this, Trump that. They're talking about Trump winning the nomination and saying that we have to all unite under Hillary Clinton to make sure that Trump doesn't become president. He's the scare tactic. It's like people in the end will be sweating bullets, but they'll be glad that Hillary Clinton won until they see what Hillary Clinton does or what the elites do with Hillary Clinton and her government in charge. Once that does happen, once all the martial law, the war, and all the stuff that I see is inevitable under her happens, people will be looking back and saying, telling us we're not going to say we told you so, but we're going to say that you should have listened to us.
Hey, Chris.
Hey,
brother. Hey, I really appreciate that shout out. I got a buddy over here, Chad. We're sitting here listening in, and we're following along in chat. And hey, connecting voices, and that's what I do. So, hey, Michael says that was probably AT&T calling about a phone bill. So I know you're not in chat because your bandwidth and all that stuff, and knocking you off Skype. But hey, you know what, folks really appreciate what you're doing over here, Chris. You're a young man, 18, been on radio for 3 years already, and this week has been my 3-year anniversary celebration at UCY.TV with What Matters Worldwide. Did 66 episodes. One of them, Mae Brussels, filled in for me, and one of them was a train wreck, so I think Jules pulled her hair out on that one. God bless her. Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in over here and joining in chat and engaging. And let me just give a shout out to the listeners that are tuned in live right now. Let me get this open right. Also,
to Michael, I'm not on AT&T actually. I have something almost as bad, Metro PCS. Actually, I would say it's worse. Metro PCS is like the worst coverage. They got, if you see their coverage, it's like only like if you go around the country, it'll only be on the highways or whatever. And here it's like all spotty. You get like 2 bars in some places, some buildings you get nothing. Oh yeah, but to the people in chat, that's a
Yeah, let me
eight
give
questions.
let me give him a big old shout out right now. We got Captain Gringo at the top and Hopper HB. John Teeter is here. Thank you, Nathan Frazier. He's following next here in about 25 minutes. We have the great and wonderful Jules that is responsible for this platform right here where the Connecting Voices happens. We have Matty Clues, Mr. Bonds, possible suspect. That's Michael. So, yeah, we've definitely got him nailed down. There's Ron with Game On, and he airs right here on UCY.TV Sundays and Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. We have Solvenurum. That is Walter and the Solvenur event every Saturday. Right now he is reading and has been reading Tragedy and Hope 101, Joe Plummer. And I think we're up maybe through the 5th chapter right now. Tomato, our great friend Mike, SLC, and here I am, myself. And you're not in here because of bandwidth, so relaying the chat. And thanks everybody for being along and being a part. And I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back on the saying is that we got about 20 social minutes left, so I guess I could mention a little bit about what I'm not trying to be all gloom and doom when I say about predictions of what's going to happen, but when you see them put more boots on the ground in Syria, when you see them continue to put the sanctions on Iran, even though they said that they would lift the sanctions on Iran, but they still are there after they made them sign that agreement. And then you see both of the candidates. One said that she would bomb Iran, and another is Trump saying that he would. That he thinks we signed a horrible agreement with Iran. But the truth is that when you look at the Iran agreement, is that they are inspected every 24 hours, and they pretty much have an open door in all these other foreign, all the United States, Israel, or whatever. Well, the inspectors supported by those countries go in anytime they want, and what Iran was supposed to receive in return, yes, was $150 billion. But I'm pretty sure that it's not actually we're paying them directly the $150 billion to them. They were supposed to receive that via sanctions to be removed. That's how much more money they'd be able to make. But now they kept the sanctions on them, so they're not getting anything in return. And now they're being pretty much what's being committed is espionage. Because they are what they were expected, what they were supposed to receive, they're not receiving. They're not consenting to this under these conditions. The contract's been breached. At this point, this is no longer the contract had been. Few clauses of the contract had been breached very early into the Iran deal being signed a few months ago, and now. They still expect to do their nuclear inspections all the time, and Iran, they've been saying for 20-something years that Iran will be building a nuclear bomb within 6 months, and it still hasn't happened yet. They've been assassinating nuclear scientists. Israel's been assassinating nuclear scientists, a massive violation of sovereignty for years. And despite all that, the West has the nerve to say is that Iran is the one that's getting the good end of the deal. Because the good end of the deal, in their mindset, is that they're not being bombed. Anything that not being bombed is good for them. But wouldn't the good for them is them actually being left alone and not sanctioning them? But the sanctions continue to stay there, even though that they were told that the sanctions would no longer be there. They got the cruddy end of the deal, if you ask me. And the Iran deal was only to lull them into a state of false security and to believing that they won't go to war with the United States. But it looks like at this point they will go to war with the United States, and the back door in will be via Syria because they have over 15,000 troops there. So when the United States initiates war with Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian military, they will be starting a war with the Iranian military as well. Israel will jump in very early into the war, and it will be ugly because the United States is not going to let a total victory of Assad that's nearing right now. You see that they've liberated Aleppo, they're about to liberate Raqqa, and ISIS, the United States, an Israeli-supported group that most of the world knows is now, that's the case, that they're a Western finance group to take out Assad, the United States and Israel finance group to take out Assad. They are they're about to be defeated. So the United States is going to come in to take it to save their terrorist assets, because that would signify a total defeat of their plan. The plan was to take out Assad since 2006. That's what had been revealed by emails now 10 years ago. That was their plan. It was well before even the Syrian civil war broke out, which they constructed it. They constructed the protest, like they constructed Arab Spring in Libya, which really those people belong to Islamist and terrorist groups, just like what happened in Syria, where now Libya is a complete disaster controlled by really nobody besides militia here, militia there, different kinds of terrorists there, and other terrorists there. And the only people that are truly fighting ISIS are a few cut-off loyalists that stayed fighting since the end of the war. But everybody else, they're not fighting it. It's a joke of an effort that's going on in Libya against ISIS, and now ISIS controls a lot more of Libya than they do with Syria or Iraq. And Iraq, the Syrian military and the Iranian military will work together in order to push out terrorism out of their countries. And Iran helped a lot their Iraqi and Syrian allies. And you see the panic now for the Iraqi, or the United States and their Iraqi plan, not to realize that the government of Iraq is no longer in favor of the United States plan with ISIS, that they're working with Iran, and they are in panic because they see these huge demonstrations telling Americans to leave, and they're storming into. They look like it's very close to the point where it could be like an Iran scenario of 1979, where the United States embassy gets stormed in Iraq, in Baghdad, and a major event like that happened. And they brought boots back on the ground in Iraq to deal with that, because the people are so disgruntled with the United States still staying there 15 years after they entered again, and 25 years after they entered the first time. If you were 18 in 1991, when the United States first entered Iraq, and they've been really on and off there since, you're 43 now. So you would have to be in your 30s to have lived in a time where you can remember the time before the United States was involved in Iraq. And before they were involved in Iraq was the support of Saddam against the Kurds in Iran during the 1980s. So there's been this weird affair between the United States and Iraq, really going back to 1979, when Saddam took power. And that was the same year that also Khamenei took power in Iran, on the flip side, who the United States declared to be their enemy, and they declared Saddam to be their friend. The whole policy, the odd policy of the Middle East, it goes back to the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, goes back to the funding of Saddam in Iraq in the 80s. And you see really the precursors to the wars that would happen in the 2000s was set up all the way back then. It was Carter and Reagan in the 70s and 80s. And then it led all the way up to this point, where the Mujahideen later became the Taliban that we ousted out of power in 2001, and Saddam becomes the Saddam that we later ousted out of power in 2001, 2003 out of Iraq. Both were the same people, and Bin Laden, that's a picture with Brzezinski and Bin Laden in the same picture, and people deny it. People deny that the United States worked with terrorists in Afghanistan. You bring up the fact that I've actually gotten to an argument about that with teenagers, and they tried their hardest to deny it because they didn't want to be in that place to know. Once they realized that, especially people that are pro-military, that they don't want to believe that our foreign policy is that messed up, or their foreign policy. They don't represent all of us. They don't even represent the majority of us. But the United States government has become an entity that doesn't represent the United States people. It represent the corporations and the elite of the United States, and do horrible actions. Ultimately, they become the military arm of the New World Order. The New World Order being the elites, the bankers of the world, these billionaires, and these private fortunes like the Saudi royal family with $1.3 trillion, and the Rothschilds, some people estimate all the way up into hundreds of trillions of dollars as a family. These people that are working together to try to make the entire world a fascist state that is controlled by those people. And people believe it to be a conspiracy. Look at their own words. Look at Rockefeller's own words. Look at Rothschild's own words. Rothschilds, people start saying if you talk about the Rothschilds, you're anti-Semitic. And there's actually, if you go to Facebook or whatever, you mention them in a debate, people call you anti-Semitic. It's funny, with this political correctness, you're not allowed to talk about practically anybody because they'll connect it with something. They'll connect dots that are not even there and call you whatever. People will call you over talking about, for example, the Saudi royal family or whatever, me being the least Islamophobic person that imaginable. Many Muslim friends on Facebook that I really enjoy talking to on a regular basis. And to me, actually, I actually have somewhat of I would say a legitimate interest in the cultures of Iran and Syria, and how ancient that is, and that it goes back thousands of years. Cultures of those countries before Islam was even there. But of course, in the Islamic parts of their culture, they'll call me Islamophobe or something like that. But that's the only time they'll use that word, possibly. That's actually one group I've noticed that political correctness doesn't seem to really protect. It really seems to protect more the Zionist lobby of America, mainly. This political correctness craziness. I agree. There's certain stuff you shouldn't say if you don't want an asshole, because they could really offend somebody. But you can't make it to the point where you can't say anything. There's nothing you can say practically nowadays. They will call you whatever. They'll say you're being politically incorrect. And even people claim to be against political correctness end up practicing this political correctness, zealousness of not allowing you to talk about for your Zionists. They'll call you anti-Semitic. They'll call you a Nazi. They'll call you. Facebook debates is an easy place where you can get called a Zionist, or you can get called a. Yeah, you can get called. You can get called a Zionist and a Nazi at the same time, or something like that. Well, that usually doesn't happen. You get called a Nazi, a communist, a Nazi communist, Muslim terrorist, Confederate loving, gun-toting, marijuana smoking, what else? Delusional hippie. Yeah, that seems like a stream of words that some idiot on Facebook would call one of us. And you also have to remember when you get into arguments about Zionism or whatever, that tons of them are trolls. They pay a lot of money, pay good money to people to spread disinfo about Palestine and to talk in favor of Israel. And the fact that they have to pay people to do that, it's like, if your country's so great, why do you have to pay people to be trolls on the internet? They'll call you a troll, for example, when you talk about certain topics and you disagree with the line. For example, we start talking about Ukraine or whatever, and you talk about how Poroshenko was an oligarch fascist, he's a Nazi, he's foreign rights sector, that's a Nazi Party, supporting the Savoyda, supporting the Azov Battalion, their thugs and killers. They'll call you a troll. I've even joked that I was like, yeah, you got me, an FSB troll. Working for the with FSB, for people who don't catch that reference, that's the modern day KGB of Russia. Yep, you got me, totally. I totally work for the FSB, get paid good money to do it too. Yeah, but the truth is that nobody's getting paid anything to do this alternative media stuff. We're just trying to inform people about what's going on. And what's Victory Day? Why is it so important to talk about this? Is because we've been it's really just talk about our whole history of World War II. It's been so distorted. We've been lied to about all of our history, huge portions of our history. But with World War II, they lied to us about, they may try to make it seem like it was still black and white, good guys versus bad guys, but really there was so much in between. There was so much, there was a lot of bad things that the Allies were doing, of course, the Nazis, and bad things that they were doing. The Japanese, man, horrible, brutal crimes against the Chinese. We're not talking. They don't tell us about that. That equivalent to the size of what happened in Germany was the Holocaust happened in China, with the Japanese killing the Chinese people in brutal fashions, and the huge front right there on the western front, the Japanese expansion westward as they tried to conquer China. They conquered Southeast Asia, and then they were trying to conquer China. Vietnam was conquered by Japan at one point, and eventually after Vietnam's involved in World War II, then they had to fight the French, then they had to fight the Americans, then they had to fight the Cambodians, all in that order right there. So they were fighting like constantly from like 1940 to 1980. 40 years of straight warfare. That's why you don't even see too many people in Vietnam nowadays that you don't see people that are 90 years old that would have seen all that in their adult lifespan, because a lot of them were killed. A lot of them just died from the stress of that horrible time that a lot of that was for the Vietnamese people, especially during the worst part of it, the Vietnam War. The United States spraying Agent Orange and sarin gas and the mass bombings of residential neighborhoods in Hanoi, and the propping up of a brutal dictator in South Vietnam of Diem during the early 60s, and what these and the massacres by the United States military. And Kissinger was the one that ordered the sarin gas to be dropped inside of Vietnam. You hear too much about those chemical attacks against the Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War, where you hear plenty about Assad's supposed chemical weapons that have been removed from Syria. It's absolutely ridiculous. Vietnam was actually the second war after World War II for the United States. They almost completely leave out. It doesn't seem weird how there's this war, the Korean War, that's like in the middle between World War II and Vietnam, but it's almost not talked about. Even though it was a very brutal, ugly war, with 26,000 Americans dying each year of the war. 53,000 died at the end, in just a 2-year span. And then the Korean Peninsula was controlled by the South, or half and half. It was controlled by the North. It was controlled by the half and half by the South, and controlled completely by the South, and controlled completely by half and half North and South and North, and all that happened in a year span. It was absolutely crazy how quickly the land was being seized during that war. The Syrian War has had some pretty quick amounts of land exchanges too. Like, for example, but it's been a little bit slower, more gradual effort inside of Syria. Look what happened with since 2014. At one point, ISIS had a huge part of the Syrian of the Syrian territory. Now, at this point, they've been pushed out back to the deserts, and they only have small parts of the territory. And the Syrian military seems to be marching on, possibly to total victory within just a few months, maybe even just a few weeks at this point. the Russian people or the Russian military has
Hey, Chris.
went. Hey,
Hey, yeah, hey, me and my friend sitting here listening in, and this guy has had a lot of great commentary. I tried to get him to come on and add in some, but people are radio shy, and he's privy to a lot of information. It's been I wish I could share it with you, and perhaps maybe another time we can. I just want to thank everybody for joining in. Before we run out of time, I will remind you to stay tuned. Nathan Frazier's next, Live Free FM, Entrepreneur, all that good stuff. Nathan is, he's got a lot of good things to say. So if you're listening downstream, come on back every Sunday night. Chris airs live every Sunday.
every Sunday at time, Eastern time,
9.
6 Pacific time.
That is correct. And Nathan Frazier follows. And it will be 10 o'clock where I'm at in the Central Time Zone. So I wish I could paraphrase what my friend here has been saying. And he surprised me because we've not talked about some of these things. He is very well aware and in tune with what's going on in the world. And most people are not, as you and the listeners will probably agree. Most people are clueless. This guy right here, he's got a clue. And if you know me, I don't ever shut up. And so I guess that's a good thing sometimes. But anyways, listen, everybody, thanks for tuning in to UCY.tv. And I invite you back every day in the morning. We're going to wake up and I'll be listening to Hal Anthony with some lessons from Behind the Woodshed, and followed by our pilot broadcast with Jules, the founder of UCY.tv, with Before the First Cup. Jules really nails it down. Listen, can you hear me? No, obviously you do. Come on back. Keep coming back, and thanks for everybody for joining in and adding in with your commentary to the chat. And
The person that was chatting was that our fellow co-host Michael, because I know he talked. It was quite a bit about World War II, and he's pretty well informed about the world today. So, was that him or was that somebody else?
There's been several people come in. Hold on, I changed my. There we go. I'm plugged back in. I changed my settings here. Michael has made a lot of good comment. I don't agree with Michael on everything, but that's okay. But I still consider him a very intelligent person and has a lot of good points to bear. And I respect Michael a whole lot. I'm just not into the voting thing in Trump. I guess that'd probably be about the only thing I might agree or disagree. With Michael. I ain't supposed to say his name. That's a possible disrespect. Tim Core.
Yeah, with some of the people that I have as some of the closest people that I collaborate with, I don't agree with them on everything. I don't know if there's a single person I agree with on everything. That would be almost kind of weird if I ran into somebody that agreed with me on everything I have to say on this show. Or on Facebook or whatever. But I wanted to close out with the show with saying is that, we have been lied to a lot about history of War II, as we've been lied to as many other parts of our about the history of the world and what's going on today, and many other political developments. And of course, as always, research and actually go find it yourself. Don't necessarily just listen to me. Go and research it yourself and actually learn how to research and use the good old, as they would say on the Trailer Park Boys, the world pipe, as they have dubbed it, the internet. And we have about
one and no return, and nobody can stop it. Malcolm Little when he knelt before Elijah Muhammad, the comet that killed the dinosaurs, changing the earth. They love to criticize, they always say I changed for the worse. Like prescription pills when you misusing them, nigga. The Templar Knights when they took Jerusalem, nigga, and figured out what was buried under Solomon's temple, Al-Aqsa. The name is not coincidental. I know too much, the government is trying to murder me. No coming back like cutting your wrists open vertically. How could the serpent be purposely put in charge of the country? Genetic engineered sickness spread amongst me. My people are so hungry that they attack without reason, like a fucking dog ripping off the hand that feeds him. Immortal technique is treason to the Patriot Act. So come and get me, motherfucker, cause I'm not coming back. This is the point from which I can never return, and if I back down